All right, welcome to the Actuarial Masterclass. We're going to go way beyond just the textbook definitions today. What we're really going to do is use the actuarial control cycle as our professional framework to dissect how these core principles actually get applied when the pressure's on. In product design, in investment strategy, and of course, in tackling those tough exam questions you know are coming. So here's the plan. We're going to build everything around the actuarial control cycle. We'll hit each stage, specifying the problem, developing a solution, and then monitoring the experience. And stick around, because at the end, we've got a super fast recap and some killer flashcards to get you ready for exam day. Okay, let's dive right in with Section 1, the actuarial control cycle. And really, you should think of this as the actuary's operating system. It's the fundamental logic that drives every single professional judgment we make. Now, this might look like a pretty simple diagram, right? But don't be fooled. This is the engine we use to navigate risk. The key word, the most important word here, is cycle. It's not a straight line. We specify a problem, we develop a solution, we monitor the results, and then, this is the critical part, that monitoring feeds right back into how we see the problem. It's this continuous loop, and that's exactly how we're going to structure our entire discussion today. All right, let's get into the first real stage of the cycle. Specifying the problem. This is all about understanding the why. And look, for a professional, this is so much more than just what the client asks for. It's about doing a deep dive into the entire external environment to understand the forces that created the need to begin with. Now, what's really important here is to think beyond the obvious, to think about the second-order effects. So take demographics. Yeah, longevity is improving, we all know that. But the real question is, what's the rate of improvement? Are cohort effects outpacing period effects? Because if they are, you could have massive systemic mispricing risk just sitting in your annuity books. And then look at economics. Sure, tax is a big deal, but what about the interest rate environment? When you have persistently low rates, maybe from years of QE, the present value of those long-term liabilities just skyrockets. And that puts defined benefit schemes under absolutely immense pressure. Okay, let's talk regulation, another huge factor. The model a country chooses has massive implications. You've got statutory, government-led regulation. People tend to trust it more, but man, it can be a blunt, inflexible instrument. On the other hand, you've got self-regulation. It can be way more responsive, more nimble. But what's the catch? The big one is regulatory capture. That's where the regulator gets a little too cozy with the industry it's supposed to be watching, and suddenly consumer protection might take a back seat. Just think about the difference between a principles-based system versus something super prescriptive like Solvency II in Europe. They lead to completely different worlds in terms of cost, flexibility, and who the public trusts. Okay, so here's a real exam question. How would you actually apply all this stuff? Let's say a company is launching an enhanced annuity product. A good answer, a really top-tier answer, would be super precise. For demographics, you'd have to talk about mortality assumptions for impaired lives, and you'd absolutely have to mention the huge risk of adverse selection, people knowing more about their health than you do. Economically, you'd be all over the current yield curve and how that hammers your pricing and capital requirements. And for regulation, you'd need to bring up specific consumer protection rules, things like suitability and transparency, especially for customers who might be vulnerable. That's how you nail a question like this. Okay, so we've nailed down the why. Now we move on to the how, developing the solution. This is where we get our hands dirty. We're designing the product, building the funding model, and, maybe most importantly, creating that all-important asset liability management strategy. Look, we all get the basic difference between DB and DC, right? The risk transfers from the sponsor to the member, but the real professional insight is in the consequences of that shift. In DB, the sponsor holds all that risk, and that creates just insane balance sheet volatility, especially when yields are low. That's what forces them into de-risking strategies like LDI, and that's what drove the massive shift to DC. But now, we have a whole new problem. A societal one. Are individuals who now hold all that risk actually ready to manage it all the way through their retirement? It's a huge question. And this whole risk transfer story plays out with insurance products too. With profit versus unit linked. On the surface, they're just different products, but the actuary's job is totally different for each. For a with-profit policy, you're deep in the weeds calculating asset shares for every single policyholder and figuring out how to distribute surplus fairly. It's complicated. With unit-linked, the challenge isn't the math, it's the communication. It's about being brutally transparent and making sure the customer truly gets that they are riding the market coaster with no safety net. It's a massive duty of care. Now, these two principles, they are the absolute bedrock of institutional investment. And you have to understand, the hierarchy here is not a suggestion, it is non-negotiable. Principle 1, matching your liabilities, is about survival. Period. You have to secure the promises you've made. Only then, once that foundation is rock solid, are you even allowed to think about Principle 2, which is chasing higher returns. If you get that order wrong, it's game over. It's one of the quickest ways to drive an insurer into the ground. So how do you actually apply that first principle? It all starts with categorizing your liabilities. It's pretty logical, right? If your liability is fixed in money terms, your best match is going to be fixed interest bonds. If it's linked to inflation, well, you want index-linked bonds. That's the perfect match. Now, a lot of people use equities to match inflation-linked liabilities. And yeah, they can work, but you have to understand it is an imperfect hedge. They don't move in lockstep with inflation. That gap, that's called basis risk, and it's a real risk you have to manage and, more importantly, hold capital against. Okay, another classic exam question for you. How should a DB scheme set its investment strategy? To really crush this, you have to start with those 2 core principles of investment we just talked about. Then, you've got to bring in the practical side, how these principles get formalized in the scheme's Statement of Investment Principles, the SIP. You need to describe the liabilities. They're long-term, they're real because of that link to salaries, and that's what tells you what assets you need. You need a mix of matching assets, like index-linked gilts, and growth assets, like equities, to hit the goals set out in that SIP. And here we are at the stage that closes the loop, monitoring the experience. This is crucial because a strategy is never set and forget. It's a living, breathing thing. We have to be constantly checking how reality is stacking up against our assumptions, everything from mortality rates to investment returns, because that's the only way to make sure we stay solvent in the long run. I want you to really let this sink in because it's a huge point that a lot of people miss. We're sort of conditioned to think volatility is bad and stability is good, but this idea completely flips that on its head. A volatile asset price isn't necessarily a problem. In fact, it might be the most honest picture you can get of the underlying reality. So if the volatility itself isn't the enemy, what is? Well, here it is. The real danger is inconsistency. It's the mismatch in how you value things. Think about it. If you're valuing your assets using a choppy, up-to-the-minute market price, but you're valuing your liabilities using some nice, stable, smoothed-out discount rate, you're creating a total fiction. It's a dangerously misleading picture of your solvency. And that exact problem is why frameworks like market-consistent valuation exist, to force you to look at both sides of the balance sheet in the same harsh economic light. Okay, systematic versus diversifiable risk. This is the absolute foundation of modern portfolio theory. And look, at this level, it's not about knowing the definitions. It's about knowing the consequence. Here's the deal. You can get rid of diversifiable risk for free just by building a good portfolio. So the market doesn't pay you to take it on. The only risk you get paid for is systematic risk, the stuff you can't diversify away. So the goal of a smart portfolio isn't to have zero risk. It's to eliminate every last scrap of uncompensated risk, so all you're left with is the pure market risk that actually generates a return.
So, there we have it. We've done a full lap of the actuarial control cycle. Now, let's lock all this in. We're going to synthesize everything with a really quick recap and then hit some flashcards to make sure you've got this stuff cold for exam day.
See how it all comes together? Everything we've talked about slots perfectly into the cycle. Specifying the problem, that was our deep dive into the external environment. Developing the solution, that was all the product design and ALM work. And monitoring the experience, that's where valuation and risk analysis come in. It's one single powerful framework that connects everything. All right, flashcard time. Core principles. Let's go. Insurable interest, the legal thing that makes it insurance, not just a bet. Pooling of risk, the magic of the law of large numbers, making the unpredictable predictable. Moral hazard, people acting differently because they have insurance. That's why deductibles exist. Adverse selection, high-risk people are the most likely to want insurance. This is why we have underwriting. Information asymmetry, one side knows more than the other. It's the root cause of adverse selection and why we need consumer protection. Got it? Next. Okay, ALM and valuation. Matching. This is your defense. You're trying to immunize against risk. Mismatching. This is your offense. You're taking on smart risks to get more return. Free assets. This is your risk budget. It's the capital cushion that lets you play offense. Market value. The honest, realistic value, even when it's bouncing all over the place. Discounted cash flow. A calculated value. It's totally subjective and only as good as your assumptions. Risk discount rate. This is how you bake the price of risk right into your numbers. Last set, funding and products. Funded scheme, assets are saved up in advance to pay for promises. That's most private pensions. Unfunded scheme, or PAG, today's contributions pay for today's benefits. Think state pensions in their intergenerational IOUs. Term assurance and annuities, two sides of the same mortality coin. One protects if you die too soon, the other if you live too long. And new business strain. The weird fact that selling a ton of new policies can actually create a short-term capital crunch for a life insurer.
And for our final challenge, a question that pulls every single thing we've talked about together. Discuss how the actuarial control cycle could be used in relation to the benefit design for a new pension scheme. A killer answer here would just walk right through the cycle. You'd start with specifying the problem. What are the sponsor's goals? What does the workforce look like? Then you hit developing the solution, propose a DB or DC structure, lay out a funding plan and investment strategy. And you'd finish with monitoring the experience. How will you track everything? And crucially, how will that data feed back into future decisions? That's how you show you really get it.
So let me leave you with this final thought. The actuarial control cycle, all these core principles we've discussed, they're timeless, they're not going anywhere. But the risks themselves, they are changing constantly. The next generation of actuaries, maybe you, will be using this exact same framework to tackle challenges we're only just beginning to understand. Things like modeling the financial chaos of climate change or pricing the long-term health risks after a global pandemic. The principles don't change, but how we apply them, well, that has to evolve or we become irrelevant.